A coworker asked me to look at their chainsaw, and of course I said yes. They didn't have a lot of information about it other than it had a fuel leak. So I took the saw home and got to looking at it and realized this is one very substantial chainsaw and was not your typical residential grade saw. Hopefully I can get it running again because I really can't wait to give it a try. In today's video, we look at this rather hefty chainsaw, and the problem is that it won't start because it has a fuel leak. Now, even if you know your chainsaw does run, I still wouldn't try to use it because a fuel leak is a recipe for a fire waiting to happen, so they were very keen on realizing that and stopped using it. Now, I'm going to try and repair this chainsaw. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. The first thing I want to do is check and make sure the engine will start and run. The reason is because if it doesn't work and I go through the job of fixing the fuel leak, then I'll have wasted a lot of time for nothing. What I plan on doing is putting some fuel into the carb's throat and then trying to start it. This will confirm that the engine has a working ignition system as well as enough compression from the engine, meaning it's not worn out. Now, this is something you don't see on any regular chainsaw. This is a decompression valve, and its job is to make it easier to pull the engine over because it has quite a lot of compression, and it could be quite difficult to pull. To use it, all you have to do is push it into the head before you try and start it. Once the engine tries to start, the valve will reset itself. While I'm here, I also want to check and make sure the spark arrestor screen is not clogged. If it was clogged, it would make the engine bog down while squeezing the trigger. The reason the screen is there is to keep sparks from leaving the exhaust and causing a fire. Now, if it is clogged, you can easily clean the carbon that's built up on the screen and then reinstall it. This one, however, is clean, so we won't have to clean it, so I can reinstall it and try starting the engine. Now, there might still be some fuel left in the lines, so if we do get it started, it might keep running versus just stopping, which is what typically happens, mainly because the saw hasn't had any fuel in the system for quite some time. So it appears the engine, and more importantly the carb, is in working condition and was running on the fuel that was still left in it from the last time it was working. There's also a lot of fuel in the area where the lines pass through the body, so I think this is where the leak is at. I also have a feeling this carb may not need any servicing for once, so I might consider bypassing the inspection. However, with my luck, there would be an issue with it, and I'd have to take it apart again, so it's probably safer if I at least look at the metering diaphragm. Next, I'm going to put some fuel in the tank and see the leak for myself, and I didn't have to wait very long for the leak to appear. After looking inside the tank, it seems the return line is not in the grommet, which means we'll have to redo the fuel lines. The good part about this whole repair is that my coworker already bought a small tune-up kit, so I don't have to wait for one to be delivered. The problem is that this is not an OEM kit, and you'll see what I mean by that at the end of the video. Now, to replace the fuel lines, we need to remove the carb. So could you replace the lines without taking off the carb? The answer is yes, but you need some special tools to get around the carb, so you can install the grommets and the lines. Since I don't have those special tools, taking off the carb will be necessary. Now, if you didn't order the kit and only had some Tygon fuel line, you need to make sure the leak isn't happening because of some bad grommets. I'm not sure why this particular saw has these large rubber grommets, and the reason is that it's just another thing to fail and replace. I'm not sure if they still use these large grommets in the current saws, so if you know the answer to this question, I'd like to know. Once the carb is free from its rubber mounts, we can then remove it along with the inlet from the engine. Then we can disconnect the return line off the purge bulb. Now, after looking at the line, it seems like the line broke right at the grommet, and that's the reason there's a leak there. Now, even though the return line is the one that broke and the fuel filter line looks to be undamaged, I'm still going to remove it and replace it. Of course, the reason is that I already have a fuel line ready to install, but I wouldn't say anything if you decided not to replace it. Now, it's a decision I would only make after physically inspecting it in person. So here's the part that broke off from the return line, and as you can see, it's literally falling to pieces in my hands. The reason it's falling apart is, of course, the material it's made of is not completely resistant to the fuel that was being put into the tank. Next, I'll remove the last major component to the fuel system, the bulb, and then start the installation process, starting with the grommets. Unfortunately, since I did not order this kit, I don't have a link for it, but I'm sure you can still find it online. Once the new grommets have been installed, I'll then install the return line. Now, to help get the line into the grommet, I'll cut the end at an angle, then work the line into it. As you can see, I've pushed about an inch of line into the tank, which should leave enough line to reach the bulb. Next, I'll install the fuel filter line using the same method, except we'll need to pull the line out of the opening, cut the angle piece off, and then, of course, install the filter. Now, I'm not sure what the original filter is supposed to look like, but if this is a knockoff of the original one, I'm surprised it's not weighted. That way it'll stay submerged when turning the saw on its side. From all the generic kits I've seen online, they all use the same style of filter, so I'm guessing the OEM one is pretty much the same way. Now, I need to cut one of the new lines very short, and that's because I need a line that goes from the left side port on the carb to the shorter port on the bulb. That would mean the return line will then connect to the longer port on the bulb. Now, after pulling on the return line a little bit, I had to check and make sure there was still enough line in the tank, and there's still about 3/4 of an inch, which is more than enough to keep it from coming out of the grommet. I also ran the line behind the impulse line to keep it from getting in the way of the throttle linkage. The last thing I need to do before reinstalling the carb is to remove the metal plate covering the metering diaphragm. What I need to confirm is that it's not beginning to harden or that it's out of shape. So it's not beginning to harden and it's still flexible, but it does have a few wrinkles in it. However, since they are on opposite sides, it's not going to affect it versus if there was only one wrinkle. What I'm going to do is prove to you that this diaphragm is still usable despite having a few wrinkles. What that means is that you don't always need to replace it, but if it's showing any signs of hardening, it's always best to replace it. Now, once the carb is back together, it's now time to install it back onto the engine. Now, this part of the repair always seems to fly by as compared to taking it apart. Don't forget to reconnect the short fuel line from the bulb to the left side port. Now, I probably should have connected the filter line before sliding the carb into place, but it's not tough if you use some pliers. Now, before I finish putting the saw back together, I'm going to put some fresh mixed fuel into the tank and confirm that fuel is flowing through the system and also in the right direction. If the fuel lines are connected incorrectly, fuel could either be pulled into the carb that's not being filtered, which would cause the carb to slowly starve of fuel, or the bulb would get incredibly difficult to press. However, if the lines are correctly installed and there is no fuel moving through the system, it could mean there's an issue with the carb. So when pressing the bulb, fuel should flow up the filter line and into the carb. It will then leave the carb through the left side port and into the short port and fill the bulb, and then leave the bulb and return back to the tank. As you can see, the fuel is flowing through the lines just like they're supposed to. That means we can finish installing the rest of the parts on the saw. So here's the problem with aftermarket parts. The air filter will not seat correctly, which means we'll need to make a few modifications to get it to seat better. Now, it looks close to the OEM part, but it's not perfect. Now, after making the mods to the filter, it finally fits well enough that I can install the retaining clip. The last part to install is the top cover, then we'll try and start it. If it does run, we'll make a few test cuts with it. So it seems to be running great with no issues at all, and I'm not going to make any adjustments to the carb because it started just fine, revved the way it's supposed to, and also did not bog down when cutting. And yes, this is not a substantial piece of wood I'm cutting, but it's what I have available right now until another large branch happens to fall from a tree. Another option as to why this saw would have a fuel leak would be a crack in the tank. Unfortunately, if that does happen, there's not much that we can do about it, and it's best you simply buy another saw and keep this one for parts. So in the end, this saw only needed the fuel lines to be changed, and since they already had the parts I needed, I guess they knew what the issue was and didn't want to or wasn't able to do the repair themselves. So my question is, should I have replaced the old metering diaphragm instead of keeping the original one in there? In retrospect, I probably should have, but I did prove my case that the old one still worked fine despite not being in pristine condition. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.